Welcome to episode 38 of the Trainer's Bullpen. Are tactical officers primed to use force? With Bryce Jenkins. Recently, some researchers have concluded that there is a concern regarding what they call the militarization of police. Militarization is defined as a process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. Often associated with this definition is the related concern sometimes put forward that this militarization increases the risk to public safety because of the associated increase in the use of force that accompany it. As a result of these suppositions, there is a related concern that the deployment of military-styled SWAT or tactical teams furthers that risk to the public. More current and robust peer-reviewed research, however, highlights several areas of concerns with the previous research methodology and the conclusions reached. In this interview, we are speaking with Bryce Jenkins and discussing recently published studies that provide a completely different picture, a contrary view of the risk to the public that the deployment of SWAT presents. Bryce is a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University. His primary research focuses on understanding and improving officer decision-making during potential use of force incidents. Relatedly, his research aims to understand the use of tactical officers and the implications of their use. In this interview, Bryce discusses the research that he and colleagues published titled Primed to Use Force, a systematic review examining the relationship between tactical experience and use of force. This study was published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology in February of 2024. And just a reminder for our listeners, this research paper is available for you to download over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Well, I have a spoiler alert. Bryce and his colleagues conclude in their paper that there is growing evidence that due to their additional training, equipment, experience, that tactical officers actually reduce both the likelihood and the severity of force. Now, on to the show. Bryce, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to talk to us today.
No, thank you for the invite, Chris. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I've listened to the good, bulk of your podcast, so I'm definitely happy to be a part of this.
Absolutely. Well, we're grateful to have you part of the program. And Bryce, the reason that I reached out to you is I had read 3 of your very recent papers that have been published in relationship to the deployment of SWAT or tactical teams. And as part of the introduction here, I want to read that some researchers have commented on a concern regarding what they call the militarization of police. Militarization is defined as a process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. And so now, associated, of course, with that definition is a whole bunch of suppositions that have related concerns that sometimes put forward this idea that this so-called militarization of police increases the risk to the public because of the associated risks in the use of force that accompany the deployment of, say, tactical or SWAT teams. So as a result of those suppositions and the related concern that the deployment of military-styled SWAT or tactical team furthers the risk to the public, it seems to me that you went to undertake some research with some of your colleagues into this exact issue, the deployment of SWAT or tactical teams and the risk of that. You examined some of the previous research that has been done, but Bryce, maybe we'll start with this. Like, what was it about the deployment of SWAT or tactical teams that kind of got you interested in this area of research?
Yeah, it was kind of happenstance, to be honest. I was looking for a topic for my master's thesis, and my supervisor, Craig Bennell, had kind of pitched a project idea that was really in response to a series of papers that came out of the University of Winnipeg that relied on freedom of information requests to look at the initial call type for incidents that received a response from tactical officers. And then from this kind of decontextualized data, made some very, I would say, broad conclusions and really raised concerns about what they perceive to be the overuse of tactical resources, and particularly related to the concerns that you mentioned that in their view, tactical officers are hyper aggressive and kind of primed to use force, in particularly deadly force or lethal force when interacting with the public. So when in their perspective, at least when you have the increased use of tactical officers interacting with members of the public in combination with this, reliance on using force to solve problems, then they really see this as likely to have, quite significant disastrous consequences for the public.
Right, absolutely. So you mentioned these papers that you undertook and have been published. So I'm just going to mention them for the benefit of our listeners, our audience. And just as a reminder, these papers are going to be appended to the show notes. So you'll be able to hop over to the Trainer's Bullpen at trainersbullpen.com and access these papers, which we strongly encourage you to do. So the first paper is Why Are Tactical Officers Responding to Routine Calls Using Police Data to Examine the Presence of Risk Factors During Seemingly Low-Risk Incidents. And this was published in Police Practice and Research in 2024. The next paper is called Primed to Use Force, a systematic review examining the relationship between tactical experience and use of force. And this was published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology, also in 2024. And the third paper is The Importance of Context, Re-examining the Deployments of SWAT Teams in Canada, published in Policing and Society in 2024. So, Bryce, what I'd like to start with here is there were some aspects of previous research that caused you some concern. And so maybe what we can do is start with your paper, Why Are Tactical Officers Responding to, and you put in quotes, routine calls using police data to examine the presence of risk factors. So as I read that paper, it became clear to me you had some significant concerns with the way that the previous data that had been extracted had been reviewed, and then the implications of the findings of that previous research. So do you want to start there? Tell us what your concerns were, and then how did that feed into this study that you did?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say really our primary concern was, I would say, the inappropriate conclusions based on data that doesn't provide enough information to really reach any conclusion, particularly the initial papers that relied on freedom of information requests. You just get something like the broad call classification, so traffic stop, domestic, mental health call, without any context of what happened in that incident. So it's really, I'll say, a misunderstanding of the purpose of call type. Anyone, like we try to go on ride-alongs and, understand the perspective of the police. So, it doesn't take long going on a ride-along to find out that the variety of calls that fall under a certain call code vary substantially. So, like a traffic stop, for example, could be anything from somebody who was speeding, potentially impaired, to somebody who was believed to be just involved in a targeted shooting. Those could all be traffic stops, but clearly the level of risk posed in that incident varies quite substantially. So it was really just digging deeper, kind of beyond the initial call type, to really understand what are the nature of calls that tactical officers are responding to.
Okay, and so you said inappropriate conclusions had been drawn by the author of that previous research paper. So what were those conclusions? Can you just kind of summarize, like, what were the inappropriate conclusions that those researchers reached?
Yeah, they really recommended that tactical officers should be, barred from responding to certain call types, which we felt was inappropriate for the reasons we just explained, that the call type alone provides you very, very little context as to what happened. So to make wholesale recommendations that, tactical officers should be barred from responding to this call, doesn't make any sense. So yeah, that's really kind of in a nutshell what they're advocating for.
Okay, and why was that? Did they feel that if tactical members or SWAT teams are deployed, that did they feel that there's an increased risk to the public, that TAC teams are just waiting for an opportunity to shoot people? How did they relate an increased risk to the public and this conclusion that they shouldn't, therefore SWAT teams should not be deployed to so-called routine calls?
Yeah, I think they're concerned that the use of tactical resources will traumatize individuals, which is a valid concern. And then the second concern that they have is that, exactly like you said, that tactical officers are, in a sense, waiting for an opportunity to shoot someone. So as the frequency in which they interact with the public increases, then, the number of people shot by police is likely going to increase as well.
Okay, so in that previous study, Bryce, they had taken, so you said they did a Freedom of Information request. They got some data from, was it just one police agency or was it multiple police agencies they got data from on their SWAT deployments?
Yeah, they published 3 papers using the same data, and their most recent one, I think, had 14 agencies, mostly larger municipalities, but yeah, 14 agencies.
Okay, and so when you then did this research, did you just take the same data that they had, or did you do your own Freedom of Information request, get your own data? What was a bit of your methodology and how you got the data you used?
So for the one paper, we re-requested the same data that had been previously released in order to, I guess, determine the veracity of their claims, and not surprisingly, came to quite different conclusions. Like one of the main issues that we found when reviewing the Freedom of Information releases from those 14 agencies is the previous authors really talked about the responsive tactical teams, but the overwhelming majority of data that was released is for incidents that received a call from tactical officers. Unfortunately, the data released for the most part didn't allow for us to tease apart, how many are tactical team deployments as opposed to, say, a pair of tactical officers. But to suggest that tactical teams are frequently responding to quote unquote routine calls is unfounded when you actually look at the data released, because I think there were 2 out of the 14 agencies that solely released data on full team deployments. Every other agency included, a combination of full team deployments and calls in which tactical officers were associated with a call. And in some cases, for example, in Calgary, that was just a tactical officer being associated with a call. So if they were conducting surveillance, for example, or on standby in case, a mental health form turned into an armed and barricaded event, that would be recorded in the CAD data. But, the tactical officers did not interact with any member of the public. So to consider these full team deployments is erroneous.
Right. Okay. So that's a really important point, I think. And I'm sure most of our listeners, especially those who work with municipal departments that have their own tactical or SWAT teams, will understand that. There's so many times in which officers will deploy as frontline officers to back up other patrol officers at a call, and they're not actually responding it's not a tactical deployment. And so simply having tactical resources at a call where there's normal frontline officers would lead to certainly a inflated statistic if you calculated that as a tactical deployment. And then to your point also, many calls where the tactical team is deployed in what I would refer to as a shadow role, where they're backing up surveillance resources and they have zero interaction with the public in those types of calls. That again, if we conclude that that is a tactical deployment, we already are starting to get some very erroneous, skewed numbers, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to say it. And I think there's one really important thing to highlight is when, say, for example, a pair of tactical officers are responding to, support patrol, that's in, that's not in their full, carbine, hard body armor helmet that you would see in, a high risk search warrant or hostage taking or something like that. It's, for the most part, it's kind of a gray patrol uniform. And I would say a lot of the members of the public really wouldn't be able to distinguish between, somebody who's in kind of the dress down tack uniform as opposed to a general patrol member.
Right. Okay. And so as you got all your data then, and you went through it, and I guess one of your jobs was to properly and thoroughly evaluate all this data to try to parse, what was actually a tactical deployment versus these other types of support roles and other types of things. Was that something like, was it easy to do with the data when you started looking into it, or did you have to ask maybe follow-up questions from agencies on how they define deployments, or how did you deal with some of those challenges?
Yeah, unfortunately, with the data provided, there's a lot of unknowns as to the extent to which the data released are full team deployments, or really, I'll say, the level of involvement of tactical officers. For the most part, I think, with the exception of maybe two agencies, included the number of responding members. But for the most part, it's you know uh, either a number of incidents within a certain call type, or just a list of from the CAD output of these are the incidents that at least one tactical officer was dispatched to, and that's from our end, at least, without going into the CAD system. That's all that we can glean from that.
Okay, gotcha. So in your first paper here that we're talking about, the why are tactical officers responding to, and again, it's in quotes, routine calls, you basically, when I looked at your findings, the results, you kind of put them into three different categories. So however you want to talk about that, you want, just if you want to group it all together or keep it separate in different categories, but what were your main findings in that study?
Yeah, this is, I'll say, a similar but a different paper than I was talking about before, where we used the Freedom of Information request to the same 14 agencies. For this paper, we partnered with the Winnipeg Police Service, and I spent about 5 weeks in their headquarters and really, reviewed incidents that had received a response from tactical officers and coded the presence of a variety of things, risk factors. So things that increase the level of risk to officer and public safety. So, for example, presence of weapons, violence, threats made. Um, so really, we found that within the data that we had, that the primary response of tactical officers was responding to high risk calls in which they were either self-assigning or patrol members were requesting their presence, whether that be specifically requesting tactical resources or requesting another unit, and TAC is floating and available and other units aren't, so they're going to respond to that higher priority call. And then, kind of relatedly, we found that about 1/3 of the incidents that we coded, tactical members were responding to lower risk calls. And that's really just to help, manage the queue of calls and relieve the workload on patrol, and ultimately provide a faster response to the public.
Okay, so those wouldn't have been tactical deployments then, like you say, they're just backing up or support, which is what happens, I would think, in every municipal agency that has full-time tactical members. Is they're out there, they're in their vehicles, in their SUVs, they're not sitting at tactical headquarters waiting for the big one to come in and deploy out from there. They're usually out doing great police work and helping the frontline officers. So that's a great point. And 1/3 of the calls you said were those types of interactions, supporting frontline officers.
Yeah. And then About half of the incidents that we coded received a response of one unit. So that's often a pair of tactical officers. Sometimes a supervisor will ride alone. So the overwhelming majority of calls here are receiving a response of a pair of tactical officers. It's certainly not, full team callouts as has been suggested.
Right. Okay. And so then one of your second findings or results you spoke about, or you put it under the category of relevant environmental factors, So can you tell us what do you mean by that? How did that impact the study?
Yeah. So part of, when I was reviewing the CAD narrative for each incident, I was coding, the presence of risk factors, injuries to the public, use of force, as well as environmental considerations. So that really was kind of generated from interviews that I'd done with tactical and patrol officers as to why tactical resources are responding to certain calls. And one of the reasons, in addition to high risk calls, is there are certain environments that patrol is unable to access safely. So, for example, high angle calls, tactical officers are, at least in the agencies I'm familiar with, patrol officers don't have access to the rappel gear. That's something that's reserved for tactical. So even if this isn't a quote unquote high risk call, but there is, maybe somebody, climbed up a building and, is now stuck, but firefighters, paramedics, there is a potential risk of violence, so they aren't going to respond to this, then often it would be, tactical is kind of the only available resource who could respond to that. So that's one example. And then things like barricaded individuals are something where by policy, tactical officers have to respond to this incident.
Now, in my agency that I worked with for 28 years, Calgary Police Service, I mean, currently we do have less lethal devices on the street, extended range, less lethal. I'm not talking about taser. I'm talking about extended range, such as Arwin or pepperball or beanbag or whatever it happens to be. But for the bulk of my career, that tool was not available to the frontline officers. And so there were dozens and dozens of calls that I can remember that where a tactical car would be requested. So this, again, maybe two tactical officers showing up in a support role with extended range, less lethal, to have that important resource available. Did you find it? In looking at all of the data, were there agencies that were relying on tactical support for that type of resource as well?
I'm sure they were. Unfortunately, for the most part, with the data provided, there was really no context associated with the call type. So, yeah, we definitely know that the equipment that tactical officers have, whether that be rappel gear or sometimes even just a drone or something like that to get eyes on an area you wouldn't be able to otherwise, is definitely a reason for tactical officers responding to an incident. But with the data we had, that kind of relevant context was stripped away, and all we have is, traffic stop, domestic, mental health call, weapons,
Right.
things like that. So unfortunately, that's something that future research is going to have to look at to really be able to look at in a more in-depth way the role of tactical officers within certain calls.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And so when you spoke about the call type there and how sometimes the call type was not, clearly indicative of the actual risk that was involved at the call. Can you expand on that? Because I'm just thinking in my mind, like the very rare cases where the call comes in as we have a barricaded gunman in a house. And so the call type actually clearly delineates, well, oh, okay, that's a high risk call, because I think that as an incident commander and district sergeant, most of the calls where tactical were heavily involved in were not coded as that. They were suspicious person complaint, domestic dispute, these kinds of things. And that's what the call type stayed throughout the incident, even though the risk dramatically changed and it escalated into a tactical deployment. So can you talk about that? Did you find that the call type often masked the risk of the individual calls?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the findings that was, most interesting to me was, like for example, about 2/3 of calls where a firearm was believed to be present, these are not initially reported as firearms related. So typically, if you think of firearm as involved in a call, then it would be coded as gun call, shots fired, something like that. But exactly to your point, oftentimes, in fact, the majority of the time, it's, kind of hidden by seemingly, low risk or benign call types like, yeah, noise complaint, suspicious person, mental health call, domestic. So yeah, relying solely on the initial call type is a very crude measure of risk post officer in public safety. There are definitely times where that is the case. Like, for example, on average, a shots fired call is going to be a higher risk to officer in public safety than a noise complaint. Like, there is some level of risk associated with that, but oftentimes there is very relevant context that is neglected if you just fixate on that initial call type.
Right. So, in thinking of the previous research by the other researchers that were done that drew an alarm to this militarization of policing by SWAT or tactical being deployed to routine calls, was this part of their error, is that they didn't actually dive into the data set to go, okay, call type is a suspicious person, but if we actually read the complaint comments through the CAD history, we get to, oh, there's a gun involved, and that's actually why the tactical team is deployed? Or is that one of the significant errors in that previous research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that not all agencies released relevant context, but certainly when context was included, it was not also incorporated in their analysis in a systematic way. The only time in which they really included context was to say something like, oh, yeah, there are armed and barricades or bomb threats, but they're mostly unfounded. Um, so, interestingly, that context was considered relevant, but the fact that I think in the original analyses, around 60% of or 50% of domestics and mental health calls that had relevant context, weapons were believed to be involved, most commonly a firearm. So these are very significant, high risk calls, but that context was not considered in the analysis. Whereas, things that kind of explained away the risk of higher risk calls was definitely incorporated.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. And so, looking at the results of this study then, Bryce, what do you feel, what do you hope you and your fellow researchers would be like if an agency was to take this research paper, look at the results, what ought to be some of the policy and operational practice implications from this paper when it comes to either the deployment of tactical teams, the coding of data, the collecting of that information around tactical deployments? What would you hope would happen as a result of this?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things. One is, we discussed previously, a lot of agencies use tactical officers to augment patrol when they're not, either hitting their training requirements or, on a full team call out. A lot of people would argue that that's a very effective use of very specialized resources. So, in our view, that should absolutely continue. Again, you policies that advocate for barring tactical resources from certain call types, I think I would definitely not put much stock in that. Given the data side, I think unfortunately is very time intensive to review in a systematic way the context of incidents, but to the extent possible, it would be very valuable in doing so. And again, unfortunately, it's kind of finding the balance of including relevant context during freedom of information requests, but that often would require an FOI analyst to manually review every single incident, which would really inflate the cost to the person who's requesting. So it is challenging finding that sweet spot of including context, but not having I spent 5 weeks full time and I coded about half the incidents that Winnipeg tactical officers responded to. So this would be a very labor intensive, high cost task to do. But I'm sure there are people out there who can find ways to use AI or something like that that can kind of scrape that relevant narrative and produce a better understanding of the incidents instead of just call type alone.
Right. So in five weeks of reading police reports from the Winnipeg Police Service with their tactical deployments, I'm sure you gained quite a in-depth insight into the culture and nature of policing in the great city of Winnipeg.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate to have partnered with Winnipeg. They've been very receptive to having me out, and this analysis is kind of supplemented with about 70 hours of ride-alongs with primarily tactical officers in Winnipeg, but I was also able to shadow the call taker dispatch side, so learn more about how the calls are classified and things like that, which is really instrumental. And if you want to understand police data and make implications based on that, you need to understand from the people who are actually generating the data how it works, how it's generated, so that you have an informed understanding of what you're looking at. So yeah, that's definitely critical.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, and I echo that. Winnipeg Police Service does have an exceptional tactical team and very professional and very busy as well. So,
Yes.
in kind of shifting our focus now, so I think that's very helpful as a foundation for how you looked at the data and actually got some clarity around the actual deployments and what they do and don't look like. I'd like to shift to the study Primed to Use Force, a systematic review examining the relationship between tactical experience and use of force, because it seems to me this is like really the big second supposition that those other researchers, Rozier and Walby, that they adopted was that when tactical team members are deployed, there's an increased risk to the public. Like, you better watch out because these people are just out there waiting to use force. So there's an increased risk. And I'm going to talk about a comment here that you made. So I'm pulling this out of one of the reports here. You state that some researchers have opined that tactical unit deployment increases the risk to the public. In fact, and so that I don't misquote you, you say exactly this. One of the major criticisms about the increased use of tactical officers is the suggestion that these officers are predisposed to use force, including lethal force, when interacting with the public. The assertion that tactical officers are primed to use force in combination with their increase in routine calls is suggested to have severe consequences for the public. Example, increased killings by police. So with that kind of setting the backdrop for springboarding into this prime to use force study, let's talk about that. So okay, why did you do this study, and what were you hoping, or what were your research questions going into this one, Bryce?
Yeah, really, it was, I think, exactly like you said, kind of a natural following of, you know, the main concerns with that body of research regarding the use of tactical officers as their perceived overuse in seemingly benign or low risk calls, and really the claim that the training and equipment that they receive, kind of creates this militaristic mindset in which, they view members of the public as enemy combatants and therefore are essentially primed to use force. And this really, is in stark contrast from that of the police regarding tactical officers. One thing that really kind of echoed through in my interviews with patrol and tactical officers is, they, due to their additional training and experience and equipment, have a lot of ways to reduce the level of risk to everyone involved. And then we also were aware of a couple of studies that had actually directly examined decision making of tactical officers and patrol officers. And these found that, in kind of rapid shoot, no shoot scenarios, tactical officers were less likely to shoot somebody who was, armed with a cell phone, for example. So, yeah, I'll say this perspective, I guess, didn't really sit well with the available research that we knew of. And I guess in our view, that research didn't meaningfully incorporate this, kind of field of studies that have looked at directly in the same scenario, comparing decision making of SWAT and patrol officers. So, yeah, we wanted to kind of bring this into the conversation, and that was really our purpose.
Sure, absolutely. And just sort of to double down on that, you say in your report that the militaristic training that tactical officers receive is claimed by some to influence their decision-making processes such that officers are more likely to use force, including deadly force, when interacting with the public. But then you state, however, there's a growing evidence that due to their additional training, their equipment, and their experience, tactical officers actually reduce the likelihood and the severity of force. So we can see that you and your colleagues are pushing back fairly hard on that narrative that there's an increased risk to the public with tactical unit deployment. So as I understand this paper, Primed to Use Force, this was a systematic review. Is that correct? So can you tell us, tell our audience, what does that mean? So because we're not familiar with all the different types of research and the methodology. So what is a systematic review, and what did you do in this case?
Yeah, very briefly, we kind of initially thought of, what we wanted to examine, kind of what requirements needed to be met to be included in this paper. So, for example, the paper had to directly compare tactical and either patrol or recruits on, potential use of force incidents. And yeah, really, we searched, can't remember how many databases off the top of my head, but quite a number of databases looking for basically every paper that we could find that specifically compared the decision-making processes of tactical and patrol officers. And then we really just reviewed all of the papers and kind of came up with, I'll say, it kind of, I guess, clusters into four kind of aspects. Two are kind of behavioral outcomes, and then the two are kind of the underlying processes that might explain the differences in the decision making. So, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if.
Yeah, so you distilled, as I just wrote down some rough notes here, but it seems you distilled everything down into, eventually you got to 10 previous research papers, but I think you started with close to 400 at the beginning. And that really, so that's the systematic part of it, right? Is trying to cast your net wide and gather all of that, anything that may be related, and then start parsing through it and narrowing it down. And you ended with 10 studies. And so what I'm going to do is you've got these great headings in your paper, and you talk about, like, as you are unpacking the reality that there is not only is there not an increased risk to the public with the tactical deployment, the risk to the public is actually enhanced. There's a greater safety margin when we get experts to respond to these types of calls, and the use of force is less. The risk and danger to the public is less. But you break it down, and I love these categories. You speak about naturalistic decision making. You speak about expertise in tactical officers. So can we start with that? Like, why would you focus on naturalistic decision making. Well, first of all, actually, I'm going to back up from that. Can you tell us what in the world is that NDM or naturalistic decision making, and how does that impact an officer's risk assessment and decision making process?
Absolutely. I would recommend anyone listening to listen to Joel Suss's podcast with you. He's has a lot more experience in this topic than I do, so I would highly recommend, if anyone hasn't listened to it, to listen to that podcast. But really, naturalistic decision making kind of arose from the recognition that relying on undergraduate students with kind of artificial tasks really was insufficient for understanding how experienced practitioners made decisions in the real world. So really, it focuses on kind of understanding the decision-making process that separates novices from experts. So you can use this in a variety of domains, whether it be healthcare, aviation, the military, policing. And ultimately, the goal of NDM researchers is kind of finding what separates novices and experts, and then accelerating the learning process of the less experienced practitioners, so that you kind of bootstrap the learning process and get them up to speed faster. Because really, from this perspective, the way that you learn is largely the accumulation of experiences, and that takes time. So if you can find ways to kind of hijack the learning process and give people targeted exposure to learning opportunities in ways that actually specifically target the underlying decision making strategies, then you can get somebody up to speed a lot faster before they are interacting with people on the street, or performing surgery, or whatever the domain may be.
Right. So is it fair to say then that the tactical team member would have a brain full of sophisticated mental models from their training and their experience, and so their ability to engage in that rapid sense making of when an incident's unfolding on the street may be substantially superior to, say, a novice or a less experienced officer who doesn't have the benefit of that mental Rolodex? We often refer to it as the mental Rolodex.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to summarize it. Yeah.
So when it comes to those mental models then, and the expertise that tactical officers have, like, how does that relate to the actual operational risk and the enhanced decision making on the street? Because I think it's just natural. Everybody would go, yeah, well, obviously tactical officers are far more skilled and far more trained, and that doesn't make them better or worse police officers. It just means as a specialty unit dealing with rapidly unfolding high consequence events, they have a superior ability to deal with those situations. But how does that actually play out on the street as far as the risk to the public? Like, did you look at, is there research in this paper or others that have demonstrated, like, no, look, where the metal meets the meat, as it were, on the road, that tactical team members don't use increased force, they actually make better quality decisions, and their judgment around use of force is actually superior than frontline officers? Can you comment on any of that?
Yeah, I think really this paper was the first time that my colleagues and I tried to take stock of the available research that's out there, to really try to answer that question. And yeah, really, I guess we found that, much like you said, when looking at kind of shoot no shoot decisions in scenarios, which are consistent across all participants, so the environment is a constant. We do find that tactical officers are less likely to shoot someone when they are, say, rapidly drawing a cell phone as opposed to a firearm, for example. So yeah, just one example, like in the studies that we found, the greatest difference in performance for kind of shoot no shoot decisions was 18% of tactical officers kind of erroneously shot somebody with a cell phone, as compared to more than 60% of the sample of recruits. So this is quite a marked difference in, you have the same scenario, same amount of time, but, basically 3 times less likely to, shoot somebody with a cell phone. So.
Right, exactly. And if I have the correct paper in mind or the study in mind that you're referring to there, Bryce, I think that was actually, and that was a rapidly unfolding, unpredictable scenario in which a subject suddenly turned on a police officer and presented either a handgun or a cell phone, and the researchers were looking at eye tracking and decision making and all of that type of stuff. And you've referenced that in your report. That's another great study to look at as well. I found it interesting. I've never really known these numbers before, so I appreciate you putting this into your report that under the heading of tactical or expertise in tactical officers, you said that tactical officers dedicate, so they get approximately 500 hours annually on average, as far as like training, dedicated time to training compared to an average of 10 hours, only 10 hours for the average frontline police officer dedicated to use of force training and decision making and that type of thing. And kind of why don't we just go to a spoiler alert here, because in your discussion at the end of it and your recommendations, you make a recommendation about that for agency administrators, that if we really want to accelerate or increase the quality of decision making from our frontline officers, it comes at an expense, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The difference in, the amount of training that's afforded to tactical officers as opposed to patrol is remarkable. There are, sometimes it's hard to meet that 25% of shift time, or about 500 hours, just given the demands on a unit. But it's, I think if you look at it, they'll get more training in terms of use of force, kind of scenario based training, in a month or a week potentially, than patrol members do on an annual basis.
Right.
And then,
okay.
really in combination with that is, the tactical officers are primarily responding to, higher risk kind of critical incidents. So, really from the perspective of NDM, it's kind of the accumulation of these incidents that, does facilitate the learning process. And then another thing that's really embedded within, at least the tactical teams that I'm aware of, is, like post-incident debriefs, where you really reflect on, the process, how it went, find ways for improvement. And that's quite a significant catalyst in the learning process. And I know some of your other guests on this podcast have talked about that. It's quite different between, say, patrol, where unfortunately you have to move to the next call in the queue, and there may not be time to dedicate to reflecting on, kind of your own performance during an incident, because there's the next call in the queue. Whereas oftentimes tactical officers kind of have more of that luxury of going back to headquarters and kind of, dissecting sometimes for hours, how a call unfolded and ways in which they can improve.
Right. You bring up such a great point there, Bryce, and I don't want to give it short thrift, because it's so important to understand the relationship between debriefing calls that you go to, and often, so I'll define what I mean by that a bit, because debriefing often looks like officers all giving each other high fives or whatever on the street immediately after the call, and then, like you say, they zip off to the next call. But really, a meaningful debrief, a hot wash, whatever you want to call it, should really, there's a guided process for someone to lead people through some meaningful self-reflection and thought processes around what did we do, why did we do it, what was the information available that caused us to make those decisions, what worked well, what didn't work well, what would we do differently in the future. And the more that agencies can embrace a culture, a learning organization, I like to call it, a learning organization of embracing a culture of that debrief model, not only for those officers that attended that call, but then the broader question is now, once we've captured that learning, now how do we share it across our organization so that all of our members can benefit from learning from it? I think it was Ben Franklin who said that a wise man learns from the mistakes of others, but a fool insists on making his own. How can we learn from what we do? And not only the things that went, and here's the other issue, is we often focus on the things that we did that maybe were less desirable, but why aren't we reinforcing and cementing the great stuff that our officers are doing at calls? Because they're making great decisions out there very often. And we should be also, reinforcing those. So, what would you say about, if we want to increase the decision making and accelerate that in our organization, would this be something that would come out of the recommendation from this paper?
Yeah, I think there's a few kind of main takeaways, and to me, definitely one of them is I don't know exactly how to do it because there are demands of calls in the queue. So I don't know how best you can balance that with taking time to debrief, but clearly that is a critical aspect of learning is self-reflection in a deep and meaningful way. So yeah, I'm not sure how you can try to carve out time to manage that given the realities of you know oftentimes overworked and overburdened patrol officers. So yeah.
Right. Well, and I would think anybody would look for researchers to give those operational answers, right? I mean, because every agency has their own unique challenges and staffing and manpower and resources available. But I think, what I took away from this paper is, as a principle, if we want our people to be better decision makers and we want them to be better decision makers faster in their careers, we need to invest in their training. And training looks like a lot of different things, including like this whole perceptual cognitive expertise piece around decision making as well. So I'm just going to read one of your conclusions in this because I think it was just so impactful, and then I'm going to have you kind of tie this study together in a bow. I can't believe we're already approaching 1 hour into our interview here, but you say this: the findings from our review, and again, this is primed to use force. The findings from our review suggest that, one, the use of tactical versus patrol officers in these circumstances may reduce the likelihood of deadly force being used by police, and two, that when force is used by tactical officers, it is a likely product of the high-risk incidents that they respond to, rather than some predisposition to favor force over other positive alternatives. So anything you want to add on to that, just a double tap on those conclusions?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Like, to me, something that I'm always struck by is, if you had a surgeon who was operating in a high risk environment, and then you compared their rate of complications to somebody who does, elective surgery that is very low risk, likely the conclusion is going to be that, the surgeon operating in the high risk environment has more complications. But to me, you kind of fall off the wagon when your take home is, therefore, there's an issue with that individual's training and we need to rectify it. To me, it's a byproduct of the environment that they're working in. And you can't compare, just given how vastly different the situations are, you can't compare, say, the use of force rate between tactical officers and patrol unless you're looking at the exact same scenario in cases like this research, where it's kind of a predetermined stimuli that way it's a constant and you are able to compare it. But just looking at, operational data, for example, to me, there's a real fallacy in trying to make comparisons in use of force rates between tactical officers and patrol officers. And the other thing that I guess I would add is these studies are really one officer interacting with a role player with the bare equipment, like for the most part, it's their pistol. So this doesn't take into account, working in a team environment with individuals that you trust with additional, equipment, less lethal equipment, having the tactics and the cohesion of a team. So it would be really interesting to create scenarios where you have, patrol officers with the equipment that they're given as compared to tactical officers with the equipment that they have, and then look at, the disproportionate outcomes that happen to that, because that I feel is a truer reflection of kind of the realities of the job in terms of comparing outcomes of tactical versus patrol. This is a very valuable series of studies and kind of synthesizes that an individual officer is not primed to use force, in contrast to some of the assertions that are made. But I feel in many ways this is kind of an underreporting of, the potential value of tactical resources.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. That's great how you summarized all that together. So, Bryce, we're bringing the interview to a conclusion, my friend. Is there anything that you wished I would have asked you that you wanted to make sure you got out, or any thoughts that you want to pass on to our listeners before we conclude?
No, I think this was fantastic. You did a great job as always, and there's nothing I can add.
Well, I want to thank you, Bryce, for what you do and your interest in doing research in related to public safety and law enforcement. And I wish we had more researchers like you, but I'm encouraged because you're a PhD candidate and you're going to have your PhD before long. And I certainly hope that you decide to continue on in this trajectory of research around public safety and law enforcement, because we our policy, our practices, and our procedures, to the extent that the public is safe, they need to be evidence informed, and that evidence comes from great researchers like you. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. And we'll bring the interview to a conclusion. We've been speaking with Bryce Jenkins, PhD candidate at Carleton University in Canada. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.